I had prepared a bit of a speech to introduce Jos Gommans here, um, but I don't think I need that anymore. About 16 years ago, when I first started my PhD, I think I had a single goal in the first year of studies, which was that when I wanted to grow up, I wanted to be exactly like Jos Gommans right here. Because we studied his works, especially two of his major works, which completely revolutionized our understanding of Mughal military history, Mughal and Afghan military history. One is the rise of the Indo-Afghan Empire, and the other book is Mughal warfare. Um, and when we studied these books, these were basically paradigm shifting works that completely, you know, for a young man of 24 back then, to put it mildly, completely blew my mind, right? So thank you for that, Dr. Gommans. Jos is professor at Leiden University in the Netherlands. That is also why this talk is supported and sponsored by the Embassy of the Netherlands in Pakistan. That is why we have His Excellency, the Ambassador of Netherlands, in attendance here. So today, we will speak a bit about some of Jos's early works, some of the works that inspired me myself. I have not introduced myself. I am Professor Ali Gibran Siddiqui. I teach at IBA Karachi. I head the history program these days. I am basically a historian of Central Asian Sufism and have somehow also become a historical weapons expert for the Sindh police. I have no idea how that happened, but it did. And I think that perhaps gives me some slight bit of expertise that I can share this stage with Dr. Jos Gommans here. And we can perhaps get started on this discussion.
Thank you so much, Shibram, for these flattering words. I don't believe them, to be honest. I'm really thrilled to be in Pakistan, and I must admit, I've been 30 times to India. This is my first visit to Pakistan, and how embarrassing is that? And it beats all the visits to India. So that's perhaps it's the good news. So let me talk a little bit about. I should start with a disclaimer, perhaps, because I wrote these books that you mentioned 20, 25 years ago, and that's a very long time ago, isn't it? So I said, if you want me to talk about warfare, I was not really very happy with that topic. But okay, then you must give me the opportunity to look back a little bit, and then perhaps you, with your work, can build on that and see where we arrive in this session. I also had prepared wonderful maps, which would make my story a little bit easier, but I will try to do this without any PowerPoint. By the way, this is not about child protection, so we're going back to 5 centuries, beginning of the Mughal Empire. That's also why I'm speaking, because the Mughal Empire started 5 centuries ago. And keep in mind, the Mughal Empire was actually the dominant superpower in the 16th, 17th century. Because I mentioned this, because I come from another room where it was really about the United States, China, etc. So what I should stress here is that the Mughal Empire was a very powerful empire, and also the name that is often associated with that empire is a gunpowder empire. So that's the title of our session, is actually Beyond Gunpowder. So in these days you had 3 important gunpowder empires. So one was the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, one was the Safavid Empire, and one was the Mughal Empire. And we always forget to mention the Uzbeks in Central Asia. And of course, China was also a gunpowder empire to some extent. So what we are going to do today is look at, let's say, warfare beyond gunpowder, because also that was, for me, was very important to do that 25 years ago. So let me just stress first that, I'm from Leiden, and Leiden University has a very strong tradition in South Asian history. And so my supervisors at that time was a guy named André Wink. He wrote 5 volumes on the Indo-Islamic world. It's called Al-Hind. And another supervisor of me was Dirk Kolff. And he is also, I think, like André, a great name in the field of South Asian studies. So I think what is important to stress with these two people, I come back to them, but for me, I think what really conceptualized my idea of Mughal warfare was geography. So I worked on geopolitics, so I thought about, okay, what kind of empire do we deal with? Where is it situated? And what is characteristic about that empire?
We have slides now.
Okay, we have slides, but it's still a little bit odd. I don't mind. So these are 2 books that I wrote in it, but then they were not that long, but it doesn't matter. So then I think it is really important to think about geography when we deal with warfare. I think you always should start with geography, and often we tend to forget this because we start off. Okay, can we have the 3rd slide? Because this one we can forget. Can we have the 3rd slide? This is the first one. This is, okay, these are my great supervisors in Leiden. And then the next one. The next one. And another one. I think the sequence is slightly different. Okay, could we go to the next one? The next one. Yeah, another one. Because it's, and another one. I think the sequence is slightly different. Yeah, this one. So I think we can stick to this map. So I told you, when we deal with history, when we deal with warfare in particular, it's always very important and key to look at geography first. So I think most of my work is actually starting with this map. So this is the map of the so-called arid zone. So I don't know whether everybody can see it, but what you see is that you have the world divided in 2. So one are actually the yellow ones and the blue ones, and the yellow ones is part of the arid zone. That means we don't have that much rainfall in that area, less than ½ a meter per year. And what you see within this map is that the arid zone is extending into India, extending into southern India, but not, for example, in China. Yeah, so in China, if you would know where the Chinese wall is, I would actually say the Chinese wall is over here. Yeah, so just at the border, exactly at the margins of that arid zone. Now, I promise to be just short in 15 minutes. So why is this zone so important for warfare in Mughal India? Or should I say Mughal Indo-Pakistan subcontinent? I don't know. But whenever I use the term India, it's actually India in these days. So keep in mind, so why is this arid zone so important? So I think for 2 reasons that are really crucial. And they also come back in your story. So one reason is that these are the result of the monsoon climate. So it means that in some areas like Punjab, what is now Pakistan, but also what is now the Deccan in South India, these were extremely dry areas. What does that mean? It means that the people who lived there had their own agriculture, but there also was the requirement that, if the monsoon would actually fail, you had to have an alternative. So people in the South Asian subcontinent always had to think about a survival strategy. And the survival strategy could actually mean that if, let's say, the cultivation is actually a little bit not what they expected, they also offer their services on what is called a military labor market. So if you think about India in the 16th, 17th century, we should keep in mind that this is not the world of ahimsa, of non-violence, but this is a world in which people are extremely armored. So a lot of the peasantry is well armored, well trained, because after the crops are in or after the crops are failing, you offer yourself in the military service. Well, the survival strategy is at its most urgent in the arid zone. Because in the arid zone, monsoon is very unsure every year. So what you see is that the so-called military tribes, or the martial tribes, as the colonial officials call them, are coming from the Punjab, from the Deccan, from the area, Rajasthan, from the area that is actually relatively dry. It's only later that the British try to shift that to the east, so we have more Bengali, let's say, soldiers. But I think it is extremely important to understand that, first of all, compared to all the other empires, I think that Mughal India had a large proportion of armed men, well-trained men. So let's say the main challenge for the Mughal emperor was not so much to win battles or to take forts, which of course is also important, but was to be the best employer of all these people. And so I think so that is one reason. So one reason is the military labor market is really crucial in understanding what's going on in terms of warfare. So that goes beyond simple technology of gunpowder. The other thing is, and that is something I was really passionate about 20 years ago, and perhaps still I am, so now and then, is about what does this also demarcate, this region, is that from this region, by far the best and the largest number of war horses are bred. So what is the problem with gunpowder? If I say that the Mughal Empire is a gunpowder empire, we tend to look at, okay, there is the horse. And what you see is, I think when you think about the horse, we should keep in mind that the best horses come from Central Asia. And the reason why they come from Central Asia is because of evolution. But the evolution has something to do with the arid zone. So if I could go back to the previous, is that possible? You can see, for example, that China also needed horses for its cavalry, and so was completely depending on the steppes, completely depending on the people beyond the wall, because they provided the horses. China tried at several moments to breed its own horses in the south of China, but it never worked. So the best horses come from the arid zone. So on the one hand, we have the importance of, let's say, the military labor market, which is basically about peasants being armed, being well trained. And at the same time, there's a long-term, a longer durée pattern in the history of Asia, where there's, let's say, within 3, 4, 5 generations, there is conquest from the steppes. Whether it's the Yuan dynasty in China, people that come from beyond the wall, or in India, where there have been regular invasions from the northwest. This map is also important because you can see why the Indians never built a wall. Because the question is, where should they build the wall? So this, if you look at the map, you know, it would have been a very long wall within India itself. And so you see that the nomadic world, so the arid zone is also the world of the nomads. The nomadic world stretches into the subcontinent. And so that is also, I think, characterizing the subcontinent. So could we go back to the previous slide? Yeah, so this one, it gives you an idea how many people are really armed in India in the 17th century. So these are statistics coming from the empire. And what you see here is 4.2 million people that are armed and registered as armed people by the government. And then you have only about 400,000 cavalry people, but this does not really reflect that cavalry remains very much important. So I think already at that time, what I realized is that we should not look at, let's say, the development of gunpowder in China or Europe, but that this is something that is going on for centuries, and that if we deal with the Mughal Empire, the horse remains very dominant. So you could say that the Mughals are the Mongols 2.0. So in a way, they just follow the long tradition of Genghis Khan, of Timur, but of course there are also important adaptations that we can talk about later. Could I have the previous one then? Yeah, so here we have the military labor market. So on the left here, you can see that there are 3 groups. There are actually way more than 3 groups. But of course, the Rajputs are crucial for understanding the basis of the Mughal Empire, because the Mughal Empire, it's easy to conquer Delhi from Afghanistan, but it's very, very difficult to continue as an empire. And so you need alliances, and the alliances that was made was with the Rajputs. And the same later on happened with Aurangzeb, but it failed. So you can say the Rajput-Mughal alliance is very successful, but then with Aurangzeb, with the Marathas, it actually failed, and with dire consequences. So we have, this military labor market which needs to be controlled or let's say incorporated into the Mughal army. And then on the left, I think I made a map completely based on research, is that we should not perceive the empire as a kind of area that is fully in one color, because that suggests that we control everything. It's like the nation state. So if you take a modern map, you have all these colors of nation states. But that was also in the title of the book. The empire is actually something that is about roads and high roads, a network of roads that you try to control. So what you see here are the main roads, and the roads are very much, again, the roads are very much a result of the arid zone. And so if you think about the arid zone, the Dakshinapata, so the path to the south, the high road to the south, completely follows the arid zone. Because the arid zone is also about camels. So these armies that move to the south can only operate when they are supplied by dromedaries, by camels. And this is also a very important moment in the history of, let's say, warfare. Is, let's say, 11th, 12th century, when in Afghanistan people managed to create a crossbreed of the Bactrian camel with 2 humps and the dromedary with 1 hump from the Middle East. So they created a so-called Bukti camel, which had 1.5 hump. I always ask my students, what do you get when you mix a 1 hump with a 2 hump camel? And then you get, of course, 1.5 hump camel. And that was very efficient, because that could actually reach, it was a mixed breed that could actually reach the south of the subcontinent. And so it could follow also these invading armies from the northwest. Should I shut up here?
No, you have...
Can I have the next slide? Let's see where we get. So the arid zone is very important. So this is, again, the horse. You can, so think about it. Europe doesn't have an arid zone. This means Europe doesn't have massive cavalry. This means Europe doesn't have massive empire. Yes, of course, Europe has empires, but these are maritime empires. So the big empires of, let's say, Asia were coming from the steppes. So it's very important to realize this. And again, the Mughals are very important in that sense. Okay, the next one. Yeah, so there we have the two camels. So keep in mind, the Arabian camel didn't go to the south of China, of India, and the Bactrian camel also stuck to the north of India. But you get a kind of interbreed, and that is, so this is just an example of how important logistics is. So logistics is perhaps way more important than, let's say, weaponry. Also keep in mind that the Mughals actually managed to conquer the Deccan at some point, because they had a good deal with a tribe that is called the Banjaras. And Banjaras were also logistically very important. So they were actually ox drivers. And so they had oxen. And these bullocks and oxen were crucial for supporting long Mughal sieges of the forts of the Deccan. Okay, let's go to the next one. Yeah, so this is also something perhaps I should stress, that, of course, gunpowder is not entirely unimportant. So what you see is that you have a dominant way of warfare that's really mobile and based on the horse. So what you do with muskets, what you do with cannon. So I couldn't find very, well, this was last week, and I found this camel with a gun on it, which is called a zamburak. So this is Zamburakji. And I studied the third battle of Panipat. So the third battle of Panipat was in 1761. So the Afghans, the Durrani Empire, expands into the north of India. Again, the old pattern. The Mughals did the same. The Ghaznavids did the same. The Ghurids did the same. So it's an old pattern. So they come into the north of India. Then the Marathas come on the south. But then Panipat, the Marathas are beaten by the Afghans. And what is so interesting, I'm not saying that this is a crucial innovation, but what is interesting is that what the Afghans try to do is to incorporate gunpowder technology on, let's say, the traditional way of doing warfare. So this is gives you some idea. So what you do is you shoot from the camel a small culverin, not a very heavy cannon, of course, because the camel would actually not survive that. And then you can be both mobile and also have, let's say, increasing firepower. The next one, please. Yeah, so this is, let's say, the problem with, yeah, so that is, I don't know how much time I have.
You have all the time you want.
Shall we go back to the first slide? Yeah, so this gives you an idea about muskets. And so we have muskets are introduced in India, as they are also introduced in the Ottoman Empire in Europe. But what you see here is a matchlock. So a matchlock really means that, you know, you need to have some fire, and the fire goes to the musket, and then it fires a shot. But that it takes a while, and often the fires go out, so it can also be a complete disaster at the moment there's a battle going on. I think it is. So let's go to the next slide. So for me, it's clear that let's say a matchlock musket never really made an impact in India because of the dominance of cavalry. So it did make an impact in Europe. Because if we talk about cavalry in India, it's about thousands, sometimes 10,000 horses. If we go to Central Asia, if we talk about Europe, it's hundreds. And so it's really also a difference in number that is really important. And that's also why, let's say, the gunpowder revolution, that's also a term that we often use, is very, very late. I often call gunpowder revolution a false dawn. So there's gunpowder, people are showing off with gunpowder weapons. It's a cannon or a musket, as you saw in the last one. But on the battlefield, in terms of logistics, it didn't really make a big impact. So here we have, for example, of course, sometimes here it's, you know, here we are dealing with Bengal. So we deal with, let's say, naval warfare, which means that cannon can be efficient. Because if you use cannon on a ship, that makes a completely different proposition, isn't it? And also, you couldn't operate with cavalry massively in the Bengal, let's say, landscape. So that's why you see that in this case, this is the capture of Hooghly from, you know, the Mughals take Hooghly on the Portuguese, and what you see is a lot of cannon here on the picture used by the Mughals. So they can actually use it very efficiently and employ it in Bengal. So the next one, please. Yeah, so here you have these forts. So what I'm trying to say is that gunpowder was there, and that, for example, in Bengal it was important. You could also say in this region, in what is now the Deccan, it was also important. Can I have the next slide? So we go to a place called Gulbarga, which I visited 2 years ago. And you see that also very, very impressive fortifications. If you look at these fortifications, how do they look like? So if you would have been in Europe, you see that the fortifications of the 17th century were completely different. So this is 16th century, 15th century fortification, even earlier. So actually it starts to look like this 13th century, 14th century. So, and what you see is, you know, these round bulwarks. If you would look for something similar, you should go to the Middle East. With the Crusades, for example, you find similar kind of fortifications. And so there again, I'm saying that although we expect a revolution happening in the 17th century, because that is the model that we know from Europe, this also happened much earlier. So here there's also a kind of a false dawn.
Jos, may I interject slightly? May I interject with just one point? So we do know from the letters of Mahmud Gawan, who was the Bahmani Grand Vizier who built one layer of these fortifications in the 15th century, that they were placing cannon on these walls, at least 80 years before the arrival of Babur. So it wasn't that gunpowder was unknown to them.
No, but my point is actually how effective was it? So I completely agree with you. Perhaps we can look at the next slide, because I think the point that I would like to make is that gunpowder weapons are actually used on these walls. Could you go to the next one? Here you see we have a very, this is really the big gun. So it's very large guns being used from bastions like this. So although cannon was used also, let's say, at the outside of the fort, this is a new development from, if I'm right, 15th century, where these huge guns were supposed to lay fire on the besieging party on the other side of the wall. the point I would like to make is that as we look at how the walls look, that let's say the major revolution, if there's a revolution, happened also as a result of the use of catapults. So that was also happening 12th, 13th century. So let's say the long 12th century, where let's say the counterweight trebuchet was used, and quite effectively also in the Middle East. And then all of a sudden you see new kind of walls also actually to be very effective against mining, for example. So in that sense, yeah, so perhaps here I should stop by saying that, 20 years ago I was perhaps a little bit too rash, because 2 years ago I visited this place. Can I have the next one? There's another cannon, I think, just to give you some idea how big it is. So it's a kind of the big one, if you like. So the big one was also, I think, a nuclear weapon. But yeah, and I really wonder how effective this was. And so if you are at these places, you look at this cannon, you can fire this 3 times a day. So how effective is it actually to really be a threat for the people that besiege the fort? But thinking about what happened, in these 20 years, I think people have, in particular, criticized this part of my story, which is more in line with what you also brought in.
I wasn't critiquing it.
No, but I think you had a good point. So what about these cannon at these forts in the Deccan? And I think it happened even earlier than the Mughal Empire came into existence. So I think that is also important. But again, if you look at how these forts look like, so impressive, and they look more, let's say, 12th, 13th, 14th century castles, forts, than, let's say, the forts that we know in Europe. But again, then Europe becomes the model, and you just say, well, India
the new model.
Behind, yeah? So the point I would like to make, and I stop here, is that it is all about Central Asia. So the relationship with Central Asia, controlling the routes of Central Asia, controlling the horses that are important. And so the Mughals often said, please, we need horses, bring them from Kabul, but no riders on them. Because if there would be riders on them, they could start a new sultanate. So that was always a threat. So there was always a threat coming from Kabul of a new empire. So Central Asia remains very important. And then it starts to change, I would say, 18th century, end of the 17th, 18th century. And so this is a good moment, I think, to go to you.
Sure, but since we're in Lahore, I think we can speak a bit about Rudyard Kipling.
Yeah.
In one of his novels, which is set in Lahore, Kim, you've probably seen Kim's gun in your few days here.
I was really thrilled.
One of the main characters was Mehboob Ali, the horse trader.
Yeah.
Right? And the Central Asian connection is still so cogent that by the early 20th century, I think that's when Kim is from, right? When it was written, if not the late 19th, the Central Asian, Indo-Afghan horse trader was still important as a person who could cross between the various boundaries.
Yeah,
so
for sure. Yeah, I think perhaps we are at the last stages with Kipling. There's already some nostalgia, and there's the great game going on about who is controlling Central Asia, who's controlling Afghanistan. And we all know that it would be, it was actually totally impossible that the Russian army would invade India, because then you really have to control Afghanistan and its supply of camels, for example. Without camels, you cannot conquer India from Russia, I would say. Perhaps from Afghanistan you can, because then you have more time. But so the horse trade is crucial. So when I started my PhD, that's even longer than 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 35 years ago, when I had lots of hair. And at that time, I was studying 2 Afghan states in the north of India. And because at that time there was a discussion about to what extent the Mughal Empire declines in the 18th century. And there was a discussion, the Aligarh school of historians in India were saying, the Mughal Empire is declining. But then there were a bunch of revisionists, especially from Cambridge, a few from Leiden, a few especially from the States, but also from India, by the way. They really stressed that, it's a dynamic century with lots of new states coming up. The 2 states that I studied, one is Rohilkhand and the one is Farrukhabad, they were actually generated as a result of the horse trade. So I found out that these people came from the Swat Valley, came from what is now Afghanistan, from the Punjab, and then created states because they could sell their units, their cavalry units, to the Mughal Emperor and other employers. So Yeah, but then I think that is also a nice bridge to your work, isn't it? So if you think about the composition of the Mughal army, so you may expect, of course, if cavalry is so important, then you must have cavalry people. You must have horse people in that army. So I think apart from the Afghans, I think the Turani, so the people from Turan, from what we also can
Central
call
Asia, basically.
Central Asia, were extremely important. And your, let's say, recent work is really about that network of Turanians, isn't it? Should I say Turanians? People, Turani people.
I use a different word, but we'll get to that.
You can come back to that. So, yeah, perhaps you should tell a little bit about that. So, because at the same time, the Mughals were also very much aware that you always need to have a balance in the army. So you cannot recruit, let's say, 80% Turani people, because that would actually, well, generate a coup of these Turanis. So there must always be a balance. So I think, no, we don't have the figures, but you always had people from Iran, from Turan, you had Rajputs, you had local Muslims. So this balance was really crucial. But perhaps you can tell us a little bit more, because I must also say that you had some very nice things to say about my books, but it was actually based on very accessible material. So I just studied the chronicles, I just studied the travel accounts, and not really very original in terms of working with new material. But you do.
But I wouldn't have my work without your work, you see.
Yeah, okay.
And I should add here, Jos calls himself my scholarly uncle, but the proper word for it in perhaps the Sufi tradition is he's my Dada Ustad. And the reason is that he trained Andre Wink and he worked with Andre Wink. And then Andre Wink went on to train Scott Levi, who was my PhD advisor. So there you go. The silsila and the tariqa is right there. Could we please have the next slide?
Now I think we should have the third one. So just go quickly.
All right, so we can stop here. What we have is a very distinct image from an album which is called the Padshah Nama, and this particular one is called the Windsor Padshah Nama because, like all of our great manuscripts, they're all in England, right? This one now lies in the Windsor Palace Library. And it's very distinctive because it's one of the more gorier depictions of Mughal warfare. I'm not sure if you can notice, but especially down there, I mean, Jos, would you like to perhaps unpack this image for us using your expert eye?
Well, I know what it is, but there is, as I mentioned, the Afghans. You should not have too many Afghans in your army because they will start a coup. Mm-hmm. So this is one of these stories. I think it's about Khan Jahan Lodi, an Afghan leader. And so for the Mughals, it was really important to keep the balance. So if one of these Afghans would actually become too powerful, so they could start their Afghan empire again, as they did under the Sur, but in particular the Lodis, because it's a Lodi guy, so it relates to the Lodi Empire. So what you see here is a lot of bloodshed, violence, with people that also are recognizable, I think. Mm-hmm.
I can recognize. So the person with the knife in his hand is probably Ghairat Khan, who later becomes the governor of Hatta.
Yeah.
He is the nephew of the person standing on the left, which is Abdullah Khan Firuz Jang. The darker person down there is Yaqut Khan Habshi. That's my understanding. Person on the right is one of the famous Sayyids of Barha.
By the way, Habshi means somebody from Africa.
So from Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia now, right? That is Sayyid Muzaffar Khan of the Barha. And if we look at the symmetry of the painting itself, we see balance in other ways. So on the left, we have Abdullah Khan Firuz Jang, who is Central Asian or Turanian. And in perfect symmetry to him, completely in line with him, is the Indian or the Hindustani Sayyid military commander, in perfect parity, showing that both of them lie in perfect symmetry around a peculiar tree that is growing in the background. And since some of your work, your more recent work, is on Neoplatonic thought in the Mughal Empire, you know exactly what kind of tree this is, right? It was used by the Temurids, that is the forebears of the Mughals, as a symbol of sacro-sovereign authority. And it's the chinar tree, right? A tree that was found in every single Mughal garden that was laid out, if the climate would allow for it. And the tree itself is symbolic of the emperor who was not present on the battlefield in this painting, but because he is the supreme emperor of the entire world, the Shah-e-Jahan or Shah Jahan. Additionally, somebody possessing great cosmological authority. He is everywhere and his presence is everywhere, and he's representing as this tree that reaches out into the heavens but also holds the earth together with its roots. So in essence, what we see here is maybe that's not the right word, but it's almost like a collection of the various peoples that would have fought in his name and how he has maintained parity between all of them. And battlefields and their depictions, again, perhaps, very definitely this follows on from your work. And I'll try to be very brief about this. Battlefields and the paintings and the texts that they generated became important spaces where narratives could be created, and perhaps absolute authority, especially that of the Mughal emperors, could be negotiated by actors like Feroz Jung, who I will focus on, the person on the left in that spectacular suit of armor. I tried to recreate his armor at home by making this chainmail vest, which I'm wearing here, but we aren't going to really talk about that right now. Could we please have the next slide? So when we look at Feroz Jung in text, it's interesting that he's always referred to by his full title, Abdullah Khan Feroz Jung, Abdullah Khan victorious in battle. And every time his name is given in poetry composed by Mughal poets like Kashani or Qudsi Mashhadi, his name is always rhymed with peculiar words. So we have Feroz Jung, Osman Yaft Rang, the fearless rushed forth, Abdullah Khan Feroz Jung at their head. The sky itself changed color, struck with all-encompassing dread, right? His name in these narratives is always tied to the battlefield. And it's tied to a very masculine, very martial stereotype of sorts that is being associated with Turanian soldiery at this point. So it's not something that would necessarily be observable, but it was something that was necessarily performed on the battlefield and in text and in paintings, as we saw in the painting right before this, where the Central Asian warrior emerges as somebody who is distinguished in these paintings of these sorts. Can we please have the next slide? This is also somebody who is very important. So something that happens in about 1627 and in Lahore, where we are all sitting right now, is that the Khan of Bukhara dispatches his chief Sufi, that is, who was the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, had a portrait made of him. And we have this portrait right here. There are two portraits, actually. This is one of them. The Khan of Bukhara dispatches his chief Sufi to come to Lahore to parley with Jahangir and to secure the release of an important Khwaja Zada, that is the son of a Sufi, and a Khwaja Zada who was called Abdullah Khan Feroz Jung, because, quote unquote, such behavior where a Sufi would be imprisoned by a Mughal emperor, and a Sufi who was a descendant of an even more important Sufi from the 15th century called Khwaja Ubaidullah Ehrar, was unbecoming for the sons of Taimur, that is, the Mughals themselves.
Gibran, can I ask you something? Because what was not that clear when I wrote my book, and I think recently I worked on let's say, the Central Asian War Band. So how are these groups organized, the Turani groups? Because you mentioned Sufis. So I can imagine that if you want to recruit people from Turan, you have, let's say, relatives or friends in Delhi that you can contact by, okay, bring in your relatives or your group. But what is that group? So how did that work? So how Sufis and soldiery does relate to each other? Can you explain that a little?
So if you could perhaps have the next slide, it would maybe explain some of this, right? Um, so what we see here in people like this are a complex individuals who perhaps wear very different hats, perhaps not just hats but turbans and helmets as well. Um, and for someone like Feroz Jung, who was simultaneously a Turanian immigrant, that is an immigrant from Central Asia, an important Sufi who was a descendant of an even more important Sufi, but also a disciple of the current Pirane Pir, or the chief Sufi of the Khanate of Bukhara, who was a military commander, who was somebody who allegedly wrote his own work on farriery, or that is the upkeep of horses. He really plagiarized it, but that's a different thing altogether. All of these things add to somebody's military persona. And it is something that perhaps distinguishes them when they first arrive in a place like Hindustan and they are brought before the emperor. So something, and when he actually joins Mughal military service, it was, we can go on from here. एक और इसके बाद कर लें. हाँ. He arrives in the middle, sort of towards the end of Akbar's reign. And Akbar had a very peculiar practice where he would physically gaze upon people who were to serve him, gazing into their soul as the great sacro-sovereign emperor, and judging the hidden attributes, that lie in their deep within themselves. And for Feroz Jung, there were two things here. The first was that he probably had some sort of reputation because he had served with his uncle, who was already prime minister in Mirza Hakim's kingdom, that is Akbar's brother's kingdom in Kabul, right? The other thing is when important Central Asian soldiers or Sufis, or Sufi soldiers in this case, arrived in the Mughal court, they were often introduced by other relatives who were already in Mughal service. In this case, the word I'm using for them is a Hisari Naqshbandi relatives, because these are all Naqshbandi Sufis, that is Sufis of the Naqshbandi Tariqa, who have relocated to the city of Hisar, which is these days in Tajikistan, about 100 miles outside modern-day Dushanbe. And when they would arrive, they were often given a small mansab or a small rank in the Mughal fiscal military apparatus, and they were sent to some frontier region to serve with their relatives, often within that unit. So it wasn't just that the unit was solely composed of Sufis or solely composed of people from the same geographical region. But very often what happened was that those units, again, this is drawing on Kolf's work on Naukar, Rajput and Sepoy, that the collective identity of those military units, whether, they were Afghans in a Turanian commanded unit, whether they were Hindus in a Muslim commanded unit, they would generally take on a collective identity.
Do you mind if I ask you and make a comparison with the European scene? And so if I go to Europe, 16th, 17th century, we talk about mercenaries who play an extremely important role in deciding battles. So the people from Switzerland, the German. So is that comparable? You think it's comparable to that? So that it's a kind of, are we dealing with, so you have these Sufi, Turani groups, but can they be compared to mercenary soldiers, mercenary units? And how does that actually, how do they incorporate it? Are they incorporated in the Mansabdari systems at the same time?
Right, you can always think of Mansabdari as not just being a regular system of ranks, but also a contract that is renewed regularly. And that is perhaps something that it has in common with, the mercenary contracts that you would see in early modern Europe. And again, as we can see in Abdullah Khan's career here, he switched sides several times. And that is perhaps something that he also had in common with early, condottieri, perhaps in the Italian tradition, or with other forms of mercenary war bands in early modern Europe, where people who were militarily skilled and who knew that their military skills would be rewarded were quick to change sides, often in the middle of battle itself.
Yeah, my supervisor at that time, and I mentioned him, the other guy, Andre Wink, he also said when you have a battle in India, it's often a mistake. Because before the battle happens, you start to negotiate and to offer higher salaries, better positions to each other. You write letters, forge letters. And so in the end, if there's a battle, only few people actually are prepared to really fight. And so that's also something you brought up.
Right.
So that in that sense also, this is way beyond gunpowder, because if you have to use gunpowder, please, no, that's better not. And so of course, when the Brits come in, there seems to be a kind of a cultural shock, because they are really prepared to fight for queen and country, for king and country, which is very irrational from a, let's say, South Asian point of view.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
And in fact, for Feroz Jung, after one of the military debacles in the Deccan, where three armies, one of which was Feroz Jung's, failed to converge on the same point at the same time and were defeated one by the forces of, who was it, Malik Ambar,
Yeah.
the
There he
the
is.
general of Ahmednagar. Jahangir had Feroz Jung's portrait brought in front of him, and he cursed the portrait and said, "From today, you are not known as Feroz Jung, that is someone who is victorious in battle, but you are known as Gurez Jung, the person who flees from battle." So,
Well, what about these, let's say, the profile of Turanis in general? Because we have, of course, this kind of stereotype that the Irani is a refined Munshi kind of type. He can do a wonderful poetry, exploiting the Iranian tradition that's rich on that. And then the Turani was a kind of a barbarian,
Right.
The fighter, the honest fighter, if you like, the stupid fighter, who doesn't really know properly to behave at the court. Is that something you can recognize or not at all?
I think
Because
it's
is
more
that
of a
too much of my
performance.
Afghans here?
I think it's more of a performance. I think part of that comes from Jean-Baptiste Tavernier's
Yeah.
description, where he says that, the Iranians and the Hindustani Muslims and the Rajputs, when they eat and they're done eating, first they wipe their hands with besan or, chickpea flour,
Yeah.
and then they clean their hands with hot water, and in the end they rinse it with rose water. And he says what the Turanians do is rub their hands until the fat becomes all liquid, and they rub it into their beards, and that's it.
Yeah.
So again, it's perhaps Tavernier, hamming it up, so to speak, for his audience.
Yeah, I also think that often when the Afghans in the 18th century were at the court, that they just played, that they couldn't really do some proper Persian poetry. And so they actually played to be the let's say, the local guy from Afghanistan.
But we see that with, let's say, with Mutribi Samarkandi, who was both Central Asian and a poet.
Yeah.
And because his dialogues are with the Emperor Jahangir are published.
Yeah.
And in that we see that they aren't really all that different, because they both embody a cosmopolitan Turco-Persian culture that would have been common in, let's say, Delhi, Agra, Lahore, Kabul, Bukhara, Herat, right? And what we see instead is that they take on certain roles, where Jahangir almost plays a role where he seems to be more Hindustani than he actually is.
Absolutely.
And Mutribi tries to act more Turanian. And that perhaps takes on certain affective gestures where, again, this is in Jahangir's own words. I'm not making this judgment, but he appears to be more refined. And Mutribi appears to be more, perhaps, almost rustic in his ways.
Yeah.
And many of the soldiers, especially Feroz Jung, played up to that.
I think something that we also should mention here is that there was really a premium on going to India. So if you compare, let's say, the military salaries,
70% more for a Turanian.
yeah. So if you're in Iran, in Central Asia, there's only one thing you can do to make a career. Young man, go east. So it was like, academics before Trump wanted to go to the US. So in that sense, there was always this muscle drain and brain drain coming from Central Asia.
And
the
horse
Turanis,
drain.
of course, were very important in that sense also. Yeah.
Right. All right. I think with that, we can perhaps have some questions from the
But
audience.
I think you should explain something about the nice shirt that you have.
Oh,
now.
right.
I think
So,
it's a male shirt.
I made this when I should have been working on my book. It took me 5 months to make. I guess I was just burnt out, so I started working with my hands. It's a chain mail that actually uses the same method that you would see with the armor that you see someone like Feroz Jung wearing. And it's now called a Persian 4-in-1 weave. where each ring goes through 4 other rings, basically. And obviously, I'm wearing this like a vest on my suit, but
Yeah, good.
this
Is it for sale?
this would have actually been part of a quilted jacket,
Yeah.
something that is called a jaushan. I guess the English word for that would be a brigandine, basically. Not well.
Bulletproof
I don't
jacket,
think this
yeah.
will stop anything.
Okay.
This is aluminum, right?
Okay, I
But
see we have 10
yeah,
minutes, so let's, yeah.
but yeah, but you'd have to layer it as well. It wouldn't just be a single one you'd be wearing. But yeah, questions from the audience, sir, and then we'll just go around. Yeah. Acha, Mike. Acha, then we go this way. Then take it. नहीं.
Thank you for the insightful talk. It's always interesting to see someone from another part of the world know so much about our part of the world. Getting to my question, you mentioned the military labor market in India, and at the same time, India was expanding into Surat from Delhi and the trade route that opened up into Europe. So my question is around why the Mughals never consolidated as a naval power and instead relied on European navy.
Well, if that's, I think it's a very good question. I think, of course, the rise of the West is also the rise of let's say the fleet, and let's say the use of cannon on ships. So the Portuguese start already doing that. So why the Mughals didn't invest into this? So an easy answer, my first answer would be that for the Mughals, perhaps the Dutch and the English and the Portuguese did a very good job for them. So they so if you look at, let's say, an embassy of the Dutch East India Company going to the capital, they were incorporated by the Mughal Emperor. And so they accepted all kinds of presents that signified that actually the Netherlands or the Dutch East India Company was actually becoming a vassal of the Mughals. So they were interested in the safety of the routes, of the trade routes. They were very much interested in, let's say, the cash that was coming in through these trade routes. But they made agreements with the European powers. For example, in Surat, you have the so-called Muchauka, which is a kind of agreement that the Europeans should protect, let's say, ships to Mecca for the pilgrimage. And if they didn't do that, they would actually fight them on land. So they would actually kick them out of Surat. So there were several moments when there was a conflict, and then the Dutch or the English had only one option: is okay, let's find a compromise here, because they needed each other. And because they needed each other, I think there was not a kind of urgency for the Mughals to really invest in their own navy, although they had also their own navy, but it was relatively minor. And what they often do is they just hire another navy. So you hire another navy. The Janjira is one of the cities of Janjira. That's another group that they sometimes hired as naval forces. So in that sense, they're really very pragmatic, also efficient. So why should we invest in building a navy if they do the Europeans do a very good job for us, and also other merchants? Yeah, so I think that would be my answer. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks for a great dialogue. Can you say a little bit more about Rohilkhand?
About
Rohilkhand.
Yeah.
So this state, it doesn't last very long, and it's created by this flood of cavalry people that kind of come in after the fall of the Mughal Empire. Why does it matter? How does it figure in your studies?
Well, this is really my PhD, so that's okay. So I think what is really important is to understand the 18th century situation. So the economy is doing well. So there's often, kind of this discussion to what extent you can understand a declining empire with a good running economy. So the economy is very dynamic, it's working well. And it means that the economy supports all these regional states. And one of these regional states is indeed Rohilkhand. And Rohilkhand plays a very important role in also supporting the, let's say, the campaigns that come from Afghanistan, so of the Durrani Empire. So there's a kind of a new, I would say, a kind of repetition of an earlier pattern. Often, empire is established from Afghanistan, but you also need, let's say, local allies. So in a way, the Rohillas and also the Bangaj Nawabs in Farrukhabad. Later on, you have Najib Abdullah, so a very important Afghan military leader who is very much, the most important fundament for the Duranis to have impact on the north of India. And one of the important figures in the Rohilkhand was Rafiz Rahmat Khan. And so in a way, in the beginning, I was just studying this local regional state formation. But then I found out that Hafiz Rahmat Khan was actually very active as a breeder, as a horse breeder. And you can still do it in Rohilkhand, by the way. So you still need, again, you have to think about the arid zone. And you can breed good horses if it's still within the arid zone. And so Rohilkhand is a kind of stepping stone. Rohilkhand is a stepping stone for these invasions from the northwest. And I think if you go back in history, you would have several other examples, I would say. But without these stepping stones, it becomes also a bit difficult. Again, also because of logistics, also because of everything that you need to build an empire. The Rohillas were, for me, was really a discovery. So it started with the Rohillas by seeing, okay, they were horse traders and horse breeders. And then if you go back in history, you see that the Lodis also were horse breeders. And so that's really a pattern. So in the end, the thesis was not about these two states primarily. The thesis was really about this long-term pattern that is also described by Kipling. So every chapter has a citation from Kipling, not because I liked Kipling so much, because I thought it was really literature, but he describes a world that really exists. And I must say, I was really excited to be with the canon. Because of the Rohillas, I also started to appreciate Kipling, also as a source, although one should be careful there. And I also be careful because he was a colonial author and there are lots of stereotypes, racial stereotypes in his books. For example, about Mahmoud Ali, so the horse trader. But he also describes a really existing world that comes to an end in the 18th century and the Brits come in. So the entire focus is going to the sea, is to infantry, drilled infantry. And they beat horses, they beat cavalry, and that creates the world in which we live in the 19th, 20th century. So yeah.
All right, we can take two more questions used for everyone. Maybe you can take both of the questions together and then you can answer them together.
Hello. Firstly, I would like to add that I'm very glad I make myself come to this session particularly as opposed to politics, because you can discuss all about everything, but nothing's in your hands, whereas with history, things have already happened. You can discuss about different possibilities that could have happened. So, so my question is that, and my memory is a little bit foggy, that Babur came from Kabul or from the areas above the top. I would like for you to explain on that. And my question is that why was for Babur the areas down below the Southeast Asia were more attractive to Babur or the Mughal Empire than as opposed to the West? Why then the Mughal Empire was motivated to expand to the West? Were they busy in their own selves with their parties and stuff that the Mughals did? So I would like for you to elaborate that. And was one of the reasons being the Western powers being too much powerful than Mughals, or that's why they did think to expand westwards?
No,
Let's just take
sorry,
question as well.
okay.
Great presentation. Thank you very much. Sheshya Suri has built a line of forts along GT Road, and they have forts like Rohtas Fort near Jhelum. So there are cannons installed on those forts. So do you have any comparative analysis of the cannons, that sizes you have displayed with those found in Pakistan site?
Yeah, so what I'm trying, start with your question and come back to yours. I think what is really important is that cannons are also impressive. So you want to have the latest gadgets that are around, isn't it? You just want to make an impression on the, let's say, on your enemies, but also on the population. So I think when you find cannon in forts, it doesn't mean they are extremely effective. But yes, you have cannon, and I think it's also important to stress that you often have bronze cannon. So wrought iron or bronze cannon is actually what you see most. And so cast iron cannon, which is actually the secret of European power, is actually taking a long time before they really develop in, let's say, on the subcontinent. So again, you have cannon on walls, but my problem is that, I was raised as a student in Leiden. So you have all these expectations, what happens with gunpowder weaponry. You have fort development, discipline drill, new, let's say, standardized cannons, for example. And all that is missing. So in a way, it's not entirely fair to judge, let's say, the Mughals on that basis. But I think what is so important is to stress that the Mughals had a handicap of an advantage. So their advantage was horses. So why invest so much in cannon? So again, cannon is there, beautiful cannon, but less effective than you would expect because of the importance of the horse until deep into the 17th, early 18th century. So your question was about, what was it again?
Why did the Mughals not expand west?
Expand west.
They sort of did, though.
So, if you expand west, you expand it to the desert, isn't it? Huh? No, I think there was only one, let's say, lucrative direction if you want to expand. So, the Babur was kicked out 3 times from Samarkand. So in a way, if that was not the case, he could have stayed in Central Asia. And then he actually he started his own little sultanate in Kabul. Kabul, you see, these wonderful, rich, wealthy landscape of India that is so appealing and attractive. So I think there was always a kind of a pressure to go to India, because you also, your followers are interested in just, following you, and then you share the boot that you are taking in India. So going to Iran was, I think, never really an attractive option, I would say. Especially, so in that sense, I think the pattern is always from the northwest to the north. Although the Mongols, a few centuries earlier, they come from Central Asia, they conquered the north of Iran. So that also happens. But I think personally, I always tell my students, especially first-year students, 17th century, the 2 big powers, the 2 wealthy economies are China and India. So you want to be part of that. And it's easy because you have that trump card. You have the trump card, that is the horse. And so nothing can withstand you. Yeah.
And perhaps just to add to that, it was a bad idea fighting the Safavids, especially when, for the early part of Babur's career, a good part of his army was composed of Safavid units commanded by Safavid commanders themselves, like Bakar Najmasani, I think, was part of that. All right, with that, I think we should perhaps conclude. I would like to thank Dr. Gommans, the Dutch Embassy in Pakistan, ThinkFest, and all of you as well. Thank you so much.